Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host, Dr. W.F. Strong, and I am your guru for good books. I'm your guide to great literature, your guide to fascinating nonfiction works that are on the cutting edge of the publishing world. It is our hope on this show that we will find these fascinating books that are newly published, and we can enlighten you, we can inspire you, we can motivate you, make you healthier, happier, sexier. We hope to introduce you to a book and an author that you will love. I'm excited today because we have a number one New York Times author, the number one New York Times author for the past 5 weeks, Reza Aslan. Actually just got pushed off of that. His book is about Jesus. It is called Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth, a kind of biography of Jesus. And it had been on the number one list of the New York Times for the past 5 weeks, but it was just pushed off recently, interestingly enough, by Bill O'Reilly's book on Jesus, Killing Jesus. And we're going to talk to him about that. We're going to get him on the phone here in just a minute. But before we get there, I just want to say that I'm excited to talk to the author of a book that is number one. I've talked to a lot of authors that are in the top 10 and actually make it to number one after we have them on the show, and I like to take some credit for their getting there. I doubt it's really due to that fact, but it's nice to think so. So this book, I really enjoyed this book on Jesus because it's a look at the historical Jesus. It is a book that relies upon the historical text that the Romans had available at the time, and it relies on the context of the time of Jesus. Here's what Reza says, Reza Aslan. He says that, and this is another thing, it'll show you the style of his writing that is quite accessible. He says, granted, writing a biography of Jesus of Nazareth is not like writing a biography of, say, Napoleon. The task is somewhat like putting together a massive puzzle. One has no choice but to fill in the rest of the puzzle based upon the most educated guess of what the completed image should look like. The great Christian theologian Bultmann, he liked to say that the quest for the historical Jesus is an internal quest. Scholars tend to see the Jesus they want to see. Too often they see themselves. They see their own reflection. And yet that most educated guess may be enough. It may be enough to forge a far more accurate picture of the Jesus of history. Indeed, if we commit to placing Jesus firmly within the social, the religious, the political context of the era in which he lived, an era marked by the slow burn of a revolt against Rome that would forever transform the faith and practice of Judaism, then in some ways his biography writes itself. The Jesus that is uncovered in the process may not be the Jesus we expect. He certainly will not be the Jesus that most modern Christians would recognize, but in the end, he is the only Jesus that we can access by historical means. Everything else is a matter of faith. We have him on the phone now. Let's talk to Reza. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now, let me begin with Bill O'Reilly. Because his book, just 3 months ago, you were number one on the New York Times bestseller list for 4 weeks with Zealot, and now Bill O'Reilly, also with a book on Jesus, is number one, and yours number 10. So you haven't dropped very far, but you've been in the top 10 for 3 months, a great achievement. And so, have you read O'Reilly's book?
No, I have not read
O'Reilly's book. The only reason I bring it up is because he claims to do what you have claimed to do, is to write a book.
Well, that's just laughable. I mean, that's just absolutely laughable. First of all, I would say the biggest difference between my book about Jesus and Bill O'Reilly's book about Jesus is I actually wrote my book.
Yes, I agree, yes.
So that's the first thing. And secondly, I mean, Bill O'Reilly is a journalist. He's a television media personality. I am a scholar of religions. He is essentially just writing the kinds of stories that one would have heard in Sunday school, and then trying to make some sort of modern spin about it. And usually that spin, I have to say, from what I've read about the book, is essentially just putting his own politics into Jesus's mouth. So the way that I kind of describe it is that he's turned Jesus into the average Fox News viewer.
Yes, what I was saying is that he writes about Jesus as if he were Bill O'Reilly. He's a right-wing, tax-hating, and a conservative. But I was going toward this idea that I've always said that Jesus was essentially a liberal, but I have conservative friends who argue, say, no. He was a conservative because he was trying to push the people back to the old-time religion. He thought that Judaism was corrupt, and he was trying to move back to a more, sane and pure time. Well, as a scholar of religion, what's your take on that idea?
Well, maybe it's a little bit of both and a little bit of neither. I mean, I think that, if you just look at what Jesus was trying to do, it's true that he was trying to reform Judaism, take it out of the hands of the corrupt priestly aristocracy, no question about that. It's absolutely true that he was anti-state insofar as he did not believe that the Holy Land, as God commands in the Hebrew Bible, should be under the occupation of a pagan Roman Empire. But if you then take a look at his ministry and what he preached, I mean, this is a man whose entire ministry was predicated upon the reversal of the social order, that the rich will be made poor and the poor will be made rich, that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. That, frankly, is Bill O'Reilly's nightmare. So, in a sense, I think the problem lies not with Jesus but with us and our attempts to kind of fit him into our narratives, our current political narratives, but that's not uncommon. I think that's the important thing to understand, and why I sort of laughed when you said Bill O'Reilly turned Jesus into Bill O'Reilly, is that that's actually what we've been doing for 2,000 years. We have transformed Jesus the Christ into an infinitely malleable being, someone who can become whomever we need him to become. The fastest growing Christian movement in the United States, the prosperity gospel, preaches essentially that Jesus wants you to be wealthy, that Jesus wants, that material success is a sign of your favor with God. Well, I would just really be hard-pressed to find any kind of scriptural evidence for that view, and yet it's an incredibly successall, fast-growing version of Christianity. And again, it just goes to show that we have always, all peoples and in all times, transformed Jesus into what we want him to be.
Well, and Jesus never said to his disciples, "Get in your Mercedes and follow me."
Right, exactly. Yeah, make sure to turn in your money on time.
And that's the prosperity gospels essentially makes the argument that
it's essential. That's absolutely right, yeah.
And if you're not rich, then your faith is wanting.
Yes, in fact, I always joke that it's the Jesus wants you to drive a Bentley gospel.
Well, you made this point on when you were on Bill Maher, that people get out of Jesus what they need to get out of him.
That's right.
It reminds me of Francis Bacon's favorite, I don't know if it's favorite, but one of his famous sayings is, people believe what they prefer to be true.
Right. Very good, yes. By the way, this is true of scholars as well. I admit in my book that because we're talking about a man that is so buried in the shadow of sacred history, that oftentimes, what is really required in reconstructing the life of the historical Jesus is a lot of really educated guessing. And oftentimes what that means is that the scholar himself can't avoid but bringing in his own political or social ideologies. The great Rudolf Bultmann once said that scholars tend to see the Jesus that they want to see, and too often they see themselves. I think that's correct. But while that's true of, I think, everyone who looks at the historical Jesus, what the scholar at least and the historian at least try to do is maintain a sense of objectivity, to try to put Jesus in his time and place, and to allow that time and place to define who he is, rather than our particular time and place to do so.
Well, I think you make a great point of that in the book, that you cannot separate theology from context, that we have to understand Jesus within the time that he lived if you really want to understand his theology.
That's right. That's absolutely correct.
Now, you teach religion at University of California at Riverside, right?
Well, I'm in the creative writing department, but I also teach religious studies.
When you teach religious studies, and I suppose you teach Christianity and world religions, or you have some time that you spend on it, I assume. What are
I do, yes.
What are the epiphanies for students when you start talking about Jesus? What's news to them?
Well, it's funny because it's the fact of Jesus's Jewishness. Now, I say that that's funny because everybody knows that Jesus was a Jew. All my students know Jesus was a Jew. The most conservative Christian knows that Jesus was a Jew. But rarely do we stop and think about the consequences of that fact, which is that everything that Jesus said or did has to be understood strictly within the Jewish context of his time, that he is a Jew speaking to other Jews about Judaism. And that changes everything. All of a sudden, what you read becomes stripped of its theological overlay, and instead you are forced to focus on what a Jew would mean when he says, for instance, I am the Messiah, what a Jew would hear when someone else would say the kingdom of God. And that becomes really, in many ways, the key to unlocking the mystery of the historical Jesus, his Jewishness.
Was he trying to create a new religion?
I don't think so. I don't know if he would have even thought of that as a possibility or as a concept. We are, after all, talking about a very poor, very likely illiterate, uneducated Jewish peasant who was quite innovative in the way that he interpreted Judaism, but who nevertheless wouldn't have any kind of conception of breaking free from Judaism to create a wholly new religion. On the contrary, as he himself said, that he's come to fulfill the law, not abolish it. The law is Judaism. That's what when he says the law, he means the religion.
Well, I think a lot of people don't understand that the New Testament was not written until about 60 years after the crucifixion.
Right. So, the standard dating, there's some debate obviously about this, but I would say the nearly unanimous consensus of scholars is that the Gospel of Mark was written first, sometime after 70 A.D., maybe between 70 and 75, that the Gospels of Luke and Matthew were then written about 20 years later, sometime between 90 and 100 A.D., and that the Gospel of John was written somewhere between 100 and 120 A.D. So that's quite some time after Jesus' death.
And so it was in an oral form all this time? There were just stories that were finally written down?
Well, the first thing about Jesus to be written down were the letters of Paul. Paul, of course, did not know Jesus. He converted to the movement after Jesus' death, and Paul has no concern about anything that the historical Jesus does. In fact, he doesn't really mention any event of Jesus' life except for the crucifixion and the Last Supper, and he never quotes anything that Jesus says, but except, of course, for the ritual formula in the Last Supper. This is my body, etc., etc. But other than that, Paul seems totally unconcerned with the historical Jesus, and he's writing sometime around the 50s. I think his first letter, 1 Thessalonians, is about I'd say 48, and his final letter, the letter to the Romans, is about 60. Now, we also know that there was probably this text that we refer to sometimes as Q, or Quelle, which is German for source, that existed probably sometime around the 50s as well, but this was just nothing more than sort of a quote book of Jesus, just various things that he said, his teachings. Not his actions, not the things that he did, but the things that he said, which after all, that was what was truly important to the early Christians, not what Jesus did, but what he said. So that by the time the Gospel of Mark is written, basically what Mark does is take this material, these quotes of Jesus's, and he puts them into story form. And that's how we get the Gospels.
Why did the Romans care about Palestine? I mean, why did they want this very poor country?
They didn't. I mean, it was as Cicero famously said, a hole in the corner. It was basically the flea on the back of the Roman beast. They could not have cared less about Palestine. It was just part of this vast empire that they owned. Really the only thing that sort of confused them about Palestine were the Jews themselves. They just, the Jews were a troublesome population for them. Their religious fervor, their attachment to their land, the priestly cult, all of these things were somewhat, confusing to the Romans, but they just simply did not care about the Jews or about Palestine.
Well, why didn't they just let them go?
Oh, you don't become the largest empire in the world by letting people go. For them, Palestine was just, part of the land that they owned. It was not as important nearly as, for instance, the Levant. It was not as important, certainly, as Egypt. But it just sort of, it was a way station on the way to far more important lands that they owned and conquered.
Okay. Well, I was wondering, now that your book has been out a long time and you've been interviewed by everybody in the Western world anyway, what are the things that have arisen from the book and that consistently annoy you? That people misunderstand?
Well, that's a really good question. It seems like a small thing, but the thing that I'm most surprised by is the negative reaction that I have gotten, particularly from Christians, about Jesus' lack of literacy. I just said a moment ago that this was a man who was very likely illiterate. And, there's a lot of issues in the book that, challenge some pretty basic, fundamental Christian ideas about Jesus, but for some reason, that's the one that really sticks in people's craw. And I have to be honest with you, for a very long time, I couldn't figure out why. Why is it that that's the one people keep bringing up, and that seems to really get a rise out of people. And then it suddenly dawned on me, it's because many modern people equate illiteracy with being stupid.
Yes.
And so, we live in a society, the United States, in which 98% of the population can read and write. So if you are if you're part of that 2%, we immediately label you as dumb, as, stupid. Of course, Jesus lived in a society in which, and this is true, 98% of the population could not read or write. And so the idea that Jesus couldn't read or write is obvious. It's historically factual. But, of course, that means that in that kind of society, reading and writing had nothing to do with intelligence. No one could read or write, except for the priests, the scribes, the Pharisees, and the Herodian elite. So I think that's what it is that rather than understanding that Jesus' illiteracy is just par for the course in his time, people think that what I'm saying is that Jesus was dumb, and Jesus was a lot of things, but dumb was not one of them.
So they just think you're attacking him.
Right. Exactly. Well, but it's just a fact. It's just a simple, I'd say undeniable fact that this is a man who, like the vast majority of his fellow Jews, received no education whatsoever, could not read, could not write.
And I'm sure the Romans probably didn't want them to be literate.
Right. Certainly literacy causes a lot of troubles for the powers that be. That's true even today.
Yes. The Socrates was probably illiterate.
Right. So again, it's this idea that, in a primarily oral culture, your intelligence, your creativity is not going to be based on whether you can read a text.
Now, as you are both a Christian scholar and a Muslim scholar, what are the misconceptions many Christians have about Islam?
Oh boy, it runs the gambit.
I know that we could be here for days, but if you could pick a couple.
We could be here for days, yeah. But to put it in its most basic yet most essential way, I think it's this notion that Islam is somehow different or unique. In reality, Islam is very much a part of the biblical prophetic tradition, the so-called Judeo-Christian tradition, which most, I think, Christians and Jews are quite familiar with. That the Quran repeatedly states that this is not a new religion, this is not a new message, this is the same message that was given to all the prophets from Adam to Moses to Abraham to Jesus, and then of course it thinks of Muhammad as the seal of those prophets, but it sort of considers the Quran, the message of Islam, to be a completion of the message that, the sort of self-revelation of God that begins at the moment of creation and the birth of Adam. But it doesn't think of it in any way, shape, or form as an annulment of those previous messages. On the contrary, the Quran says that, to Christians and Jews, our God is the same, our scriptures are the same. Indeed, the Quran has this very interesting notion that I've never seen in any other religious tradition that I've studied, that's referred to as the Al-Kitab, or the mother of books. And essentially, the idea is that there is this sort of heavenly ur-text in the celestial sphere, by the right hand of God, and that all the scriptures of the world, not just the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, but all the scriptures of the world are actually derived from this one single text, which is a really lovely idea if you think about it, because what basically it's saying is that if you take the scriptures of the world and put them all together, that they all become sort of a single united whole.
Mm-hmm. It's a beautiful idea, but we certainly don't get along.
No, we don't get along, but that's how religion works. I mean, the problem with religion as a man-made institution is precisely this issue that I think most people are familiar with, which is that religion is far more a matter of identity, and its absolutism creates this sort of this idea that if particularly, by the way, in monotheistic religions, that if you believe only in one God, then what you really believe in is only one truth, and therefore if anyone sort of deviates from that truth, not only are they incorrect, but they are anti-God, that they are indeed demonic.
Mm-hmm. It's complicated. I mean,
Very complicated,
it's complicated getting your head around. Are you familiar with Red Jacket, the American Indian who addressed the missionaries? There's this famous speech in American history from Red Jacket to the missionaries. And essentially he says to them, all of you come and want me to be a Christian, but you use the same book and you have such different conclusions. He said,
right.
What am I to make of that?
right, exactly.
And he says, and we have the great Father that we worship, and so if he wanted us to have that book, I guess he would have given it to us.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a wonderful speech. If you haven't ever seen it, it's only like a 1 page long, but it's one of the most brilliant arguments I've ever seen by a man who's illiterate. The other thing I wanted to ask you, anytime you do a massive research project like this, because you've been writing this book in one form or another for 20 years, right?
Yes. I've been working on other books, obviously, and other books I've published, but this one I've been researching for a very long time.
What one or two books in all those that you came across should we also read?
Well, I think probably my most famous book before this one is No God But God. And that's basically the same. It's the same book as Zealot, but about the Prophet Muhammad and the rise of Islam.
So that would be a great education for the question I just asked: what do a lot of Christians not understand about Islam?
Right, exactly. That'll pretty much answer those questions.
But in terms of your resource material, is there a book on history of religion or anything that's particularly a wonderful read?
Well, that's actually what I'm going to be working on next, is kind of a popular account of the history of religion.
Oh, that'll be wonderful, yes.
But of course, there are some wonderful books out there. Joseph Campbell, not Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism. Joseph Campbell, Murchi Eliade, Ninian Smart. These are some wonderful scholars who have written about the history of religions. But I'm going to do one that's, I think, a little bit more for a popular audience.
Well, I think you are uniquely suited to do that because, as I was reading, you have a wonderful style, and it reminded me in a kind of strange way of what Carl Sagan did for astronomy. You take a complex subject like religion and you make it accessible to the uninitiated.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do.
And it's really a wonderful read. That's one of the things I liked about reading your book on Zealot. I mean, your book on Jesus, because it was like I didn't put it down, in other words, and that's kind of rare for a book that's a history book. I read the whole thing in really a day and a half, I guess, and I didn't want to stop. I just had the world interfere, and it was full of epiphanies because I didn't realize that the the New Testament wasn't actually put into a written form until so many years. I had always had the idea somehow that the disciples were like embedded journalists and they were writing all this up as they went along. Right.
That's great. That's really great.
And that's why I was asking you what epiphanies your students have when you start covering this, where they say, I didn't know that.
Right, exactly.
And I assume many of them come from a religious background.
Many of them do, as a matter of fact, yes.
And so, when is your next book on the history of religion?
Boy, yeah, that's I'm still on book tour with this book, and I've got to get some time to breathe first before I can start getting back to work. But hopefully, I'll get back to work starting in January. That's the plan, anyway.
Well, if you can get Lauren Green to interview you as your first interview, then you can go viral and get a lot of publicity. Huh?
That's exactly that's the plan. Yeah.
She was certainly unfair and unbalanced, I must say. So now that you've had distance from that, do you have anything else that you would want to say to her?
No, except that I understand where she's coming from. Mm-hmm. I really get the sort of the fear that a lot of extremely conservative Christians have when anyone looks to be questioning their fundamental belief systems. Mm-hmm. But I think that's not really what Lauren did wrong. What she did wrong wasn't in sort of thinking about her faith. What she did wrong has more to do with her profession than her faith. Mm-hmm. What she did wrong was not even bother to read the book jacket or the bio mm-hmm. of the person that she was giving it, interviewing, mm-hmm. And so. I think that was a professional failure on her part, not a religious failure.
And does that happen to you a lot, that you're interviewed by people who have not read the book?
No,
it doesn't.
I mean, I've given maybe 10,000 interviews.
Oh my!
And certainly it's the case that some of the people have not read the book, mm-hmm. but they've at least read the book jacket. They've read the tear sheet that the publisher gives you to sort of know what the book is about. They've at least read the author biography. They've read something, mm-hmm. But I've never in my life, in all the interviews I've ever done, had an interview with someone mm-hmm. who had no idea who I was, why I was there, and what I was writing about. That is a completely new experience for me.
And there was considerable kind of bigotry in that, that you don't have the right to write on that subject. Because of who you are.
I think anybody who watches Fox News knows that's pretty much par for the course for those guys. I mean, this is a network that has spun anti-Muslim sentiment into ratings gold for more than 10 years. So, that's not a surprise. That's certainly not a surprise.
Well, and I also heard the argument that since Bill O'Reilly was coming out with his own book soon, and you were kind of, in their point of view, scooping him, that they wanted to, bring you down.
Oh, I'm certain that had something to do with it. Yeah, I'm certain about that.
Well, listen, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today on Good Books Radio. And we do have one real overriding ethic here. My co-host and I will never interview anybody unless we have read the book.
Good for you. Good for you.
Thanks again for a great read, and I'm looking forward to your next one.
Appreciate it. It was great talking to you.
Have a great day.
Take care.
That's it for this week's edition of Good Books Radio. Thank you for joining us. The book again is Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth by Reza Aslan. A wonderful read. Pick it up. Have a great day. May all your books be good reads.